What's going on, fam? Commander GEN.YAHANNA here, man. I had to get up with you. Ben Shapiro. If you don't know who Ben Shapiro is, this is a conservative, you can say podcaster, talk show host, well known in the conservative circles, so-called Jew, on conservative issues. He recently just went on the Joe Rogan show where he had a discussion with Joe Rogan about race and about the situation going on with the protests and the riots and so forth. And he made some interesting evil points. And so I want to jump in here, man, and give you a them versus us account. Joe Rogan, I think, did as best as any Edomite could do to try to have some fair play in the discussion, which I'll show you some of that as well. Here's what's good about it. It's a very good example of how other people in other nations think about what we experience. And here's what's so evil about it. How you gonna have a discuss about race concerning black people and not talk to us in the streets, not to really take seriously our account? You can't go to black pundits and black preachers and those who've been successful in society to try to explain the lack of success from brothers and sisters that's out here every day in this struggle. You can't do that. So let's take a look at what he's saying and see what we can get out of it, yo.
So I had the unfortunate experience of actually reading one of the best-selling books in the country, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. And let me just tell you, a greater pile of horseshit has never been produced by a bevy of horses. It is an awful book, and it is basically rooted in the same theory as Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. The basic definition of racism changes in this theory. So racism, you and I were sitting here discussing racism, and the way I define racism is probably the same way you define racism. You believe in the inferiority or superiority of a group based on race, of an individual based on their membership in that group too, right? That would be racism. I believe that you're inferior or you're superior based on your race. End of story, right? That's racism. That's racist. So Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi redefine racism to mean any societal structure that results in a racial inequality is itself racist.
And he's correct. Any institution that is built and established based on racism and perpetuates racism is a racist institution. So what's so wrong? Now, I don't necessarily agree with Abrams and them, but this is what they said in this particular case is correct. Finally, it's really becoming clear that racism is more than just some white supremacist who hates black people. That the institutions of today's society are built on racism against the Lord's chosen people, black people, Latino people, and Native Indian people.
So any structure that results in a not exact proportion between whites and blacks.
Does that make the NBA racist?
Exactly. The answer is kind of yes, except that the NBA is not racist because obviously it benefits black people, right? I mean, now, the NBA is not racist except it's because the meritocracy is the reason the NBA is not racist. Right. But Robin DiAngelo and Kendi both suggest that meritocracy is an aspect of whiteness. They say that meritocracy and individual are aspects of whiteness because these institutions, things like meritocracy and individualism and not seeing people's colors, these just reinforce hierarchies that end with disparate outcomes. And so what they say is in order to be anti-racist, you have to want to tear down the entire system.
Look, both arguments are dead wrong. Yes, the NBA is racist. Of course it's racist. And so is meritocracy is racist as well. Let's break it down. First of all, for those of you that may not know, meritocracy means to rule by the skilled or to rule by the best of whatever it is that you are great in. And so therefore you become the ruling party or the ruling government or the ruling body over whatever it is that's going on. But the NBA it's a meritocracy. And they try to say it's not racist because it's a meritocracy, but it's only a meritocracy when it comes to becoming a player. You can benefit in the meritocracy when it comes to becoming a player. But let's not lie to ourselves. It's not a meritocracy in the NBA on the hierarchy. You don't become a manager or so forth on higher levels in the NBA based on the fact that you are good in basketball, because if that was the case, black men would be in charge of the entire NBA, as they should be. How are you going to say it's not racist? We just had the incident with Sterling just a moment ago when he was accused and it was exposed that he was throwing black people out of his apartment complexes, paying off black, so-called black injustice groups, okay, so that he could be awarded as somebody beloved of black people when it was payoffs, okay? Not to mention, the words he was supposedly spoke against Magic Johnson because his girlfriend or his lover, another so-called minority, was, hanging around and palling around with him.
I can't believe that a man who's educated, a man who's a scholar, a man who's...
Well, believe it and stop talking about it. Let's finish our discussion with a period, okay? You're not making any good points. You can't believe this man. That's all I am. I'm not a good person in your eyes. If I was a good person, you wouldn't say, I can't believe this. I can't believe that.
What am I
Which are all lies. I love this.
Look at all this negativity coming from...
There's no negativity. I love everybody. I'm just saying, in your lousy Instagrams, you don't have to have yourself walking with black people. You don't have to. If you want to, do it.
If it's white people, it's okay? If it was Larry Bird, would it have made a difference?
You're just a big fighter. I could see who would want to live with a woman like you. Who would want to live with a woman? All you ever wanted to do was fight. You're a born fighter.
I'm sorry that you're mad.
You're in the worst mouth.
Why are you so angry, honey? What's wrong?
Well, why would you bring up Larry Bird? What has he got to do with it? You can walk all night long with your sisters or your family.
I saw someone I admire Magic Johnson.
Okay, good.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
He's made a lot of changes for his community, for the world, for the people, for the minorities. He's helped a lot of people.
Why are you forcing this down my throat? I'm finished talking to you. I have nothing more to say.
And I took a picture with someone I admire.
Good.
And he happens to be black, and I'm sorry.
I think it's nice that you admire him. I know him well, and he should be admired. And I'm just saying that it's too bad you can't admire him privately. And during your entire life, your whole life, admire him. Bring him here, feed him, him. I don't care. You can do anything. But don't put him on an Instagram so the world has to see, so they have to call me. And don't bring him into my games, okay?
So just in that was clear enough. But let's just look at it from the so-called data, okay? If meritocracy or based on your merits, you became great, then black men would run the NBA. Black men would be all of the managers. They would be all of the people in charge of the NBA. They would be everyone who was calling the shots. Why aren't they? Because it's not a meritocracy once you get past the point of being a player. It's based on racism. But that meritocracy, of course, these two gentlemen, Abrams and the other one, are rightfully saying are racist, that it's a racist system. Okay?
Robin DiAngelo and Kendi both suggest that meritocracy is an aspect of whiteness. They say that meritocracy and individual are aspects of whiteness because these institutions, things like meritocracy and individualism and not seeing people's colors, these just reinforce hierarchies that end with disparate outcomes. And so what they say is in order to be anti-racist, you have to want to tear down the entire system. They literally say this. I'm not really, I know that I'm not misidentifying the argument because I've read their books. The basic notion that to be anti-racist, you have to tear down free markets, or you have to tear down free speech, or you have to, and what that means is, of course, that anytime there's rioting and looting, that's really just an expression of outrage at the broader American system, and so it justifies that sort of stuff. This is why you saw Nicole Hannah-Jones, the de facto editor of the New York Times 1619 Project lady, tweeting out that she appreciated that people were calling these the 1619 riots. Because once you say America is rooted in slavery and rooted in evil and a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad place, then robbing a shop is just the latest iteration of you fighting the system.
Now, I can't speak for all riots, especially the recent riot, but the riots and the protests that black people have been given and having since the 60s is based on a racist system that is based on supposedly free markets. Free markets aren't really free and equal. especially if one group of society is coming out of slavery in the most poorest situation, and you expect them to compete in a free, so-called free market with those who have made millions and billions off of those slaves and those who were participating in destroying the economies of those slaves. Of course, that free market is not free. And when it comes to free speech, the reason that they should be making this argument, even though I'm not an advocate of tearing down free speech, but the reason they should make this argument is because free speech is only free if it is truly free. What do I mean by that? Meaning, if you have free speech, but you're harassed every week, if you have free speech, but you can't get permits because of, small technicalities that only get applied to you, then it is not free speech. It is not free speech when so-called markets can create avenues to monopolize your ability to spread that free speech, and those monopolies can then hinder your free speech. It was a time in America where you had public access stations all across the country, and they had to have public access stations by law because they couldn't have private broadcast stations that monopolized or made decisions on all of the media. They slowly but surely, pretty much wiped all of that out. And as they began to wipe it out, now you no longer have those public access stations. And even when you had them, they were not properly advertised or funded the way they were supposed to be based on legislation. So, of course, the poor and disenfranchised, who had an opposite message of those who were in power and in charge, got basically slowly snuffed out from having a voice. And the same is applying now with social media, because, of course, social media is dominated by a small group of super powerful, super wealthy organizations. They now are beginning to dictate what is free speech in their so-called guidelines. So once again, free speech is not really free speech when somebody else is dictating how free you can talk, how free you can disagree. That's why I made the analogy with Viacom. Viacom has a monopoly, basically, and definitely a monopoly over black media, over television and radio, music of black America. They are a monopoly over it and gobbling up more and more every day. So is that really an avenue of free speech? It's free speech until they decide it's not free speech. All of the horrible, horrible things that have been put out by Viacom, and Nick Cannon makes one podcast showing an alternate view about white Jews and the possibility of blacks being real Jews. I ain't no possibility to us, but we know better. And of course, Viacom gets to decide what level of free speech you can utilize. So that's why Abrams and his fellows said that all of the institutions are racist. Ben Shapiro is dead wrong. They are racist. And even when it comes down to free speech, those are racist as well. Now, if you can fix white people, which is almost impossible, then you can fix those institutions. But they cannot be fixed. So that's why Christ's return is everything. Christ's return is what's going to level the playing field on this earth.
This is why you saw Nicole Hannah-Jones, the de facto editor of the New York Times 1619 Project lady, tweeting out that she appreciated that people were calling these the 1619 riots. Because once you say America is rooted in slavery and rooted in evil and a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad place, then robbing a shop is just the latest iteration of you fighting the system.
Explain the 1619 correlation to people, if you would.
Sure. So the 1619 Project is something put forward by the New York Times. It's not good history. There are 4 Pulitzer Prize-winning historians who have said this is not good history. The basic argument is the United States was not founded in 1776 with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The country was actually founded in 1619 with the importation of African slaves to American shores, because that's when the first African slave arrived in the United States, was 1619. So the idea is that the entire history of America is a history of a system that is endemically white supremacist, and that all of the Declaration of Independence is basically a lie. That the principles of all men are created equal, that was a lie when it was written, and it's a lie now. That the idea that we have rights that pre-exist government, that's a lie. All of these things are lies. The Constitution was built in order to enshrine white supremacy. and no evolution has taken place. So they essentially make the argument that from 1619 to 2020 is a continuum. Racism has gone underground a little bit, but it's still there, and it's still implicit in all of our systems. So the 1619 Project has essays blaming literally everything on racism.
How could you say that's even wrong? How could he even say that that's wrong? That is correct. First of all, the Constitution said black people were 3/5 of a man. So to act as though the Constitution was written to make all men created equal, it was not written to make all men created equal. The Constitution originally was a white supremacist document. Okay, only based on the amendments does it somewhat curtail it, but it doesn't really curtail it because, of course, the racism is institutionalized, meaning it's in the heart of the people. But it was definitely based on racism. Otherwise, they would not have put 3/5 of a man in there to be counted in the count of the people. They said, we'll count the people. We'll even count the number of the slaves as a person, but only as 3/5 of a man. Okay? 3/5 of a man, which means you need at least 3 to overcome 1. To be at least a count of a person, you need at least 2 slaves to match up. Because if you're 3/5, then you'll still need, 2 to match over 1.15 is what you come up with 2 slaves. 1.15 of a man. So you need 2 slaves to make up 1 man. Okay. And so, of course, they were trying to say a black person was not equal with a white person, but only equal to a little more than half of a white person. So, of course, it was built on white supremacy. OK. And remember now, regardless of what went on before that, once the Constitution, and by the way, slavery was fully enacted. But once they declared their independence and wrote that Constitution, then they wrote that Constitution and maintained slavery. So any racism that took place before is still a part of that system that does ride up until 2020. It rides up until today. So let's not act like it's not. Let me tell you something. Racism is what has destroyed us in this place. And it is our race that we have to turn to now to fix it. We have to turn to our own identity, turn to our own people. We have to turn around and be us to know and to act on what we should know and act on. We have to turn around and find our way back to who we are, what our God is, what we believe in. And let me tell you something, if I could, what's so good and important about it is this, is that it's in the Bible. It's in them scriptures. Let me read one for you right quick. Exodus 1:14. And they made their lives bitter, talking about the children of Israel, by the Egyptians, with hard bondage in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service, wherein they made them serve, was with rigor. You hear me? Everything that they made us to do and to serve, it was done in a racist way. That's what the Egyptians did. Egyptians were horribly racist against the Hebrews. And so has America been. It was founded based on that. It was founded when the Egyptians saw that it was a problem having the Hebrews grow and multiply in the land. They feared us overtaking. And so they did what they thought was necessary to keep us under control. And in doing so, they made us work to half to death and made their empire amazingly rich and great. And it is the exact thing America did. America got here as poor farmers and small colonists and built their empire based on enslaving us. They probably would have been overthrown by the so-called North American Indians, if not for having so much slave labor for food, for weapons, for whatever they wanted us to make to work and to do and to help them in. That's how they became great and powerful. So Shapiro's argument is dead wrong. How is Shapiro going to make this argument when it's obviously that's exactly what happened? It's exactly what happened.
So they essentially make the argument that from 1619 to 2020 is a continuum. Racism has gone underground a little bit, but it's still there, and it's still implicit in all of our systems. So the 1619 Project has essays blaming literally everything on racism. So disparities in maternal mortality between black women and white women, which, by the way, exist in Europe and in Canada. That's due to American racism.
You see, this is the problem with conservatives. Conservatives act like it's preposterous that the infant mortality rate would, it could never be based on racism. Here's what he's not bringing out. That recently the World Health Organization added a category to its infant mortality rate. And the category had something to do with deaths of babies while a woman was pregnant. Before, it was really the woman had to die based on something that had nothing to do with how the baby was handled or had nothing to do with any accident that happened. But the World Health Organization said that's not really an accurate number for infant mortality. So they added deaths of women while during pregnant, not at childbirth or not based on how the baby was handled. So, of course, the infant mortality rate, both in America and around the world, went up. Why? Because what got fitted into that category? Abortions. Abortions got fitted into that category. And then they got the real number of how much maternal death rate or, motherly death rate took place. What you don't know are tons of women die because they've had an abortion, and many times within 40 to 45 days of that birth. They die a lot of times from it. Tons of women bleed out and have all kinds of complications that later on take their lives. So he's acting like their argument is preposterous when their argument is right. That their argument is right. You're killing our women as well as our babies in the abortion clinic. And let's not even talk about the numbers of babies being killed in the abortion clinic. This is their argument, but conservatives can't see it. So we're just bringing out a conservative argument on this. Let's take a little bit more.
Traffic patterns in the United States is due to systematic American racism. Every racial disparity is attributable to a system that was rooted in slavery.
On its face, it does seem like it would be preposterous that you would blame traffic patterns based on racism. It seems insane. But if you've grown up in inner cities and you understand how inner cities work, inner cities were designed based on moving the slaves from, areas of where black people, Latino people, natives were all compact together in and out of downtown areas so that they could work, for those low wages and that they could make those downtown companies rich. Why is it that most major cities have a central downtown area with skyscrapers and major corporations operate out of that area, and then spread out beyond that area and further out, you have your minorities? Of course, things have changed in different ways over time, but these subways, subway stations, bus lines, all of these were designed and set up and set these traffic patterns up to do just that. And they did just that. You mean it's not a mistake that, your commuter train at 8 a.m. coming out of all of the outside areas from the city are packed to the brim, with everybody having to go into the city to work under the major corporations. That in itself is a racist institution. So I don't understand why Ben Shapiro finds that so crazy. When you really look at the truth about the empire, you'll find out that a whole lot of what is built here was built on this type of racism, man. Let's take a look at his conservative argument about the Declaration of Independence and how they make the argument that they're trying to fulfill the Declaration of Independence up until this day, which is in itself an admission of the mass evil racism that took place against blacks, Latinos, and natives. Check it out.
Now, the traditional notion of America is that America was founded in 1776, and that the story of America is that America did tolerate the great original sin of slavery up until the Civil War, and then tolerated Jim Crow up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. And that is a great stain and a blot on America. But the story of America is trying to fulfill the promises of the Declaration of Independence over time, make those promises available to everybody.
Once again, those arguments are insane. You telling me that you're trying to fulfill the Declaration of Independence from 1776 to 2020? Okay, 1776? Almost 245, something like 244 years. you're still over time trying to fulfill that. Meanwhile, for the last 244 years, you've been building your empire up into the sky and making it amazing. But yet, supposedly, sometime we're going to get that dream as well. This is what's destroyed us for so long. Their own self-belief that they are carrying out a righteous thing for the stain. He said it right the first time when he said it was a terrible stain on America. It is a terrible stain, just like it was a terrible stain on Egypt. And it is why that punishment must be made. That punishment must be made. And it will be made by the hand of the Lord, because it's ridiculous to think that it could be any other way. And you'll see more as we go into it.
Now, the traditional notion of America is that America was founded in 1776, and that the story of America is that America did tolerate the great original sin of slavery up until the Civil War, and then tolerated Jim Crow up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. And that is a great stain and a blot on America. But the story of America is trying to fulfill the promises of the Declaration of Independence over time, make those promises available to everybody. And this isn't my argument. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s argument when he talks in the March in Washington about fulfilling the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence. He says, we're here to cash the check, right? You issued us the check, and then you didn't let black Americans be Americans. We're here to cash the check. This is the argument Frederick Douglass, the freed slave, makes in 1852. He makes a famous speech before slavery is ended. And he says July 4th doesn't mean anything to black Americans because we're not included in the bargain. Include us in the bargain. The story of America is the Declaration of Independence, those principles that we should all basically still agree on because they're pretty good principles. Free speech, free assembly, all the things you see in the Constitution. That those things brought about greater freedom and prosperity than anything else and helped us overcome the sins that are present in all human societies and were present in the United States in extreme ways as well. But that's the counter narrative, right? The 1619 Project says that all that was basically nonsense and that America is just a history of whites keeping blacks down and that no progress has essentially been made. If there is progress, it's mostly a lie.
Yes, it is mostly a lie. Not only is it a lie, it is a horrible lie. Because first of all, if they signed the Declaration in 1776, they didn't free the slaves until 1865. So what are you talking about? It was almost 100. It was 90 years later you freed the slaves. And then we had to deal with Jim Crow, like he mentioned earlier. And what doesn't get mentioned, and here's the other argument, what doesn't get mentioned is that these things have gone on right up until 1920. It didn't end after Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. And of course, he just gave the clear proof that both Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass were incorrect. They both did say, include us in the deal, and we're here to cash the check. The thing is, here's what they did. They gave us the check. We put the check in the bank. We cashed the check, meaning we got the Civil Rights Bill passed. And then they went in our bank account and stole all the money out. What did they do? They turned around and destroyed us with having civil rights. They just found a better way to do it. And so those that argue that it's all bull, that it's just been racism all along, they're arguing correctly. That it has never changed. It has never stopped. They have never stopped doing the things that they're doing. They just find different ways to do it and name it in different ways, and that's how they keep it going. And that's exactly what has gone on all these years. Our history right up into 2020 has been just that. There's been systemic racism from all points of society. And to believe that all of this stopped and now, 50 years later, you know, we have the golden opportunity to do whatever we want to do is such a lie. It's such a painful lie to those of us who are truly awake and can see the game that's being played, which I will go into more detail as we go on. Bear with me, y'all. And let me tell you something. And here, Joe Rogan makes a good argument. He says, is there a middle ground? Is there some place in the middle that it could all fit in and it could all work? And he begins to make his argument against Ben, which is some good points. Not as strong as we would make, but strong points nonetheless. Let's take a look at it and see where he goes with it.
And so every disparity now can be attributed to historic disparities between white and black.
Is there middle ground? So if we look at 1776 and we look at the Declaration of Independence and we look at America today in 2020, there clearly is some impact in the echoes of slavery and then after that Jim Crow. There's clearly some impact in these deeply impoverished communities that don't seem to advance.
Yes. So to make the argument about institutional racism, there's a couple ways you can read this. When people say systemic racism or institutional racism, I usually ask them to be a little more specific in what they mean, because there are a few ways you can read that. One is history has impact. Of course, that's true, right? That's true for everybody. It's true in your family history. But if you have a grandfather who went to prison on a particular charge, that leads to poverty for your parents, which led to more poverty for you, right? People have histories. Those histories are embedded in their life experiences, and that's true for societies as well. All of that is for sure true. Then there's the question as to whether the institutions today are racist. And that's not quite the same thing, right? Because history has consequences is not the same thing as saying the rules today are racist. Because the rules today are not racist, actually. The rules today are quite not racist.
Ben Shapiro just tried to make the argument that today the rules are not racist. That today society, that the institutions of today's society are not racist. It is insane to think that they are not racist today, that these institutions do not operate the same way when they are filled with racist people. All you have to do is look at the police. That's an extremely racist institution. That's just one institution. Not to mention individual and private racism, like just institutions being non-racist, if you could make that argument, which is not a good argument. But even that doesn't say that all institutions, all private institutions are no longer racist. It's a joke.
But historically, it's fairly recent. If you go from the civil rights movement to 2020, we're really not talking about that much time.
We're talking about 3 generations.
50 plus years.
60 years, yeah.
I
mean, it's
50 plus.
Right,
in the world of, in
the vast span of human history, it's not
a very small amount of time.
Right.
So clearly there's some impact of both racism and then Jim Crow laws.
Finally, an ounce of truth. We had to wait this long to get an ounce of truth of what was going on. Finally, Joe comes in and says, look, it's only been 50 something years. And Ben Shapiro is still, he's trying to stretch, 60 years, 3 generations. He's trying to stretch it. 3 generations from slavery. First of all, it's not 3 generations. It is technically 3 generations. We're talking about 3 overlapping generations. 20 years, then 40 years, then less than 20 years. Okay, more like 15 years on the 3rd generation. Okay, and they expecting, of course, black people to catch up with 400 years. I'll give you 350 years of America's institutional racism and oppression. It is ridiculous to think that way, which is why all of the ideas that you're going to have fair play or build institutions that are not racist or build laws that are not going to be racist, all of it is ridiculous. Because you had a 350-year head start, and racism in America is just as strong as it was back in the 1600s. The proof of that are the protests. The protests alone are showing how racist they are. Donald Trump in the White House is clear proof of how racist this empire is, man. So for Ben Shapiro to try to make the idea that, institutional racism is over and it's been 3 generations, and watch him try to make this argument. Watch him try to make this leap, which will show you what is really in the hearts of those people that have ruled over us and those who have benefited so greatly from this empire. Like, people are not running to join this empire because it has some secret formula for you to get rich and for you to be wealthy and for you to be well-to-do. It's because it's based on the captivity and oppression of the slaves of this empire, which are the Lord's chosen people. And that never wants to be discussed.
So that's where I'm saying there's a middle ground.
Yeah, and it is important for people on my side of the aisle, conservatives, to acknowledge and recognize the importance of history in people's living situations now. And it's important for people on the other side of the aisle to, at the same time, not attribute every single thing to history. Because
but
people
isn't there
who are born,
always something like that? There's always like extremes on each position, and the truth lies somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, but I don't think that it lies as far in the dead center of that as people, I think, want it to.
This is why conservatives try to act like they're not racist when they are extremely racist. That's why he made the argument. Well, listen, that's true, but let's not attribute everything to racism. Why not? It's been 50 years since we finally, 50 BS years since a civil rights movement. And they acting like, what is your problem? Don't blame everything on us. We've been free 50 years, 50 some odd years. You've been free hundreds of years, had empires all over the place, built the most powerful empire in the world. And now 350, almost 400, no, really it's 400 now. 350 years later, you decide, okay, now we'll pass a civil rights bill. And let me explain something else too. That's not even discussed. Yeah, the civil rights bill did get passed in 1965. But the civil rights bill also brought out something else that should be made clear. In 1965, racism was in full swing. Remember, those brothers and sisters had to get beat half to death. Many of them killed, shot to death in cars in 65. Now, 55 years later, and you expect black people to not act like, you know, institutional racism is the biggest problem. When, how long did it take for us, if at all, to get you to stop being a racist against us? It has never happened. So even though the paper got signed, even though the law got passed, that law doesn't apply to us. If it did apply to us, we wouldn't be being pulled over by the cops, beaten, shot to death by the cops, abused every day by cops. It wouldn't, all that you see going on in the black and Latino communities would not go on if your racism was gone. So it's a joke to think that in 3 generations, all racism is gone. It's a joke. Now the real monster comes out that's in conservatives. Make better decisions. Here's what's so amazing about the statement that he said. He said when his people arrived here, they couldn't speak the language. They couldn't get into country clubs. They couldn't get into Harvard. But they were able to do business with other whites. They were able to open up businesses in their own neighborhoods. None of their cities got burned down to the ground by white supremacists. Matter of fact, they were even more protected when they got over here, okay, than ever, because of what they were going through, and had an enemy in Germany, Hitler, who America was fighting. So they were beloved by America when they got here, long before the World War II. And they were not treated the same. And to say that it was the same for them as it is for us, who spent 350 years being completely destroyed by the rest of white America, is insane. And not only white America, but those same white Jewish people. And here's what makes it triply worse. This is what makes it triply worse. He's saying when his people arrived here and they dealt with racism and dealt with different things, their people arrived here. They didn't stay and have to beg the Nazis for civil rights. They didn't have to stay in Germany and beg the Nazis for civil rights. They came over here and couldn't speak the language and couldn't get into Harvard and country clubs, but they had opportunities here that they did not have in Germany. Why? Because the Germans were absolute racist against them, which is why they left in the first place. Well, guess what? We had to stay here. We didn't have nowhere to go. America and England didn't set up a country for us after slavery, but they did set up a country for Jews after Adolf Hitler. And after the 1945 war, World War II war ended, they set up the state of Israel in 1948. And since that time, billions of dollars have been poured into the state of Israel from both America and England, and in the form of reparations from Germany. So for Shapiro to make the argument that, you know, my people came here as immigrants and had to go through the same thing is such a lie, and such a racist lie. And if you asked him if he was a racist, he would say he doesn't have a racist bone in his body, and he believes he's not a racist. But what he just said, to try to compare our slavery and our having to continue to suffer under Jim Crow laws, under racism in the 60s, under all the hardship, under the crack epidemic in the 80s done by the United States government. 1980, 20 to 25 years after the civil rights movement, we had to face pretty much the same that they had to face with the gas chambers. They got the gas chambers. We got crack cocaine pushed in every ghetto in America. And this guy sits around and acts like, oh, you know, my people went through the same thing. White Jews have not gone through what black Jews have gone through. The lost 12 tribes of the children of Israel here in America had to suffer through and stay under. Let's see how they would feel if everybody in the world had not given them the state of Israel and said to them, listen, forgive the Nazis. The Nazis are writing a new constitution. The Nazis are going to have equal laws. They're going to pass laws that let everybody be equal. So stay under the Nazis, stay in Germany, and things will get better. And the promise of the new constitution will be better. And all institutions of Nazi Germany is not inherently racist. Go tell them that. They didn't do that. They got the hell away from them in 1948, and life got good for them. And monies came from everywhere to support them. Monies came to Europe and to the state of Israel, both from governments and from individuals. They imported tens of thousands of Polish Jews, tens of thousands of Jews from Lithuania and Bulgaria and different eastern states. And those people came over here, took our jobs, made money off of us, and then turned around and sent that money back to the state of Israel to make it rich and powerful, man. And eventually started migrating back over there and setting up their own homes in their own land. So don't tell me it's the same. It's as heinous to even act like it could be the same. It's heinous to even frame his lips. But that's what conservatives don't understand about themselves, that they are inherently racist and liars.
What I mean by that is the problems that have plagued communities in the United States, not just the black community in the United States, but problems of racism or problems of sexism. The way those get alleviated is people making better choices over time. Right? That is the problem. That's the way that those issues get alleviated. When Jews arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, to talk of my people, when they came, they were impoverished. They didn't speak the language. They were banned from country clubs. There was open discrimination against them. They were banned from Harvard. Right? Harvard Law School had quotas on Jews. The way to fight against that is to make good decisions. And so you fight against the system to make sure that the system has rules that apply equally to everyone.
Right, but you clearly see that there's a big difference between people coming over here willingly and doing so in order to better their lives versus someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property, and then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history.
And let me add something else. He made a statement. He said the way those problems get alleviated is people making better choices. Let me tell you something. The best choice that we can make is to do just what they did, to separate from them, to start to serve Christ instead of trying to be a part of today's society, but to start to move away from the norms of today's society. I'm meaning in every way. You got to go to work. I'm not saying let's become nomads. You got to go to work. You got to function in society. But they function in society by separating themselves. Go to the Jewish community in Brooklyn, man. Go over there and look at and walk through their community. They will treat you like you're not even standing on the street corner. They will not make eye contact with you. They will not speak to you. Some of their shops, they won't even take the money out of your hand. They'll want you to put it on the counter. Okay? And so they treat you like you don't exist, and they totally focus on each other. And they totally focus on themselves. And they call themselves the chosen people, even though blacks in America are the chosen people. And if black people and Latino people and Native Indian people focused on themselves like that, we would do amazingly before the Lord. We would do great before the Most High power. Okay? Just to add that note in.
The problems that have plagued communities in the United States, not just the black community in the United States, but problems of racism or problems of sexism, the way those get alleviated is people making better choices over time. Right? That is the problem. That's the way that those issues get alleviated. When Jews arrived in the United States in the early 20th century, to talk of my people, when they came, they were impoverished. They didn't speak the language. They were banned from country clubs. There was open discrimination against them. They were banned from Harvard. Right? Harvard Law School had quotas on Jews. The way to fight against that is to make good decisions. And so you fight against the system to make sure that the system has rules that apply equally to everyone.
Right, but you clearly see that there's a big difference between people coming over here willingly and doing so in order to better their lives versus someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property, and then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history and red line laws and all the other things that were put in place to sort of keep them in very specific areas, which to this day remain crime-ridden, gang-ridden, deeply impoverished communities.
Well, that's true, but the question is how much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
But how much of that 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is based on him growing up in this fucked up environment where that's what he models, where everything around him is crime and gangs, and you imitate your atmosphere, which what all humans do.
Right.
Not only that, those crime-ridden areas were created by you. Like, you created those crime-ridden areas. Those crime-ridden areas weren't created on their own. They were created by you. And those institutions still exist and still keep that crime-ridden area functioning like a crime-ridden area. And let's be for real, okay? The other nations are not making money and getting rich off of their own people. They're getting rich off of our people, selling us everything that we need. That's how they're getting rich. Okay, in the early 60s, white Jews made tons of money by importing furniture from Israel that were made by small craftsmen because, of course, the state of Israel had been functioning for about 20 years. So they were importing handmade furniture, bedroom sets, living room sets, and they still do it to this day, that were imported into the United States. And that's where it was sold to blacks and Latinos everywhere in America. This is how they got rich. This is how they made money. Let's be for real. They might have come here as immigrants. They might have had racism against them, but they made their money off of us. The Koreans didn't come here and make money off of the Koreans. The Koreans came here and made money doing nails for us, selling wigs to us, taking over our beauty supply shops and stores, buying out our liquor stores. And where did they get the wealth to do this? They got the wealth to do it in many cases from their own countries or from deals made by the United States and their home countries. Many of them, their home countries were the reason that they were able to prosper so well. So let's be for real, man.
Is someone whose ancestors were dragged over here to be sold as property, and then dealing with the repercussions of that being your family history and red line laws and all the other things that were put in place to sort of keep them in very specific areas, which to this day remain crime-ridden, gang-ridden, deeply impoverished communities.
Well, that's true, but the question is how much of that is historic redlining and how much of that is an 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
But how much of that 18-year-old kid today deciding to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is based on him growing up in this fucked up environment where that's what he models, where everything around him is crime and gangs, and you imitate your atmosphere, which what all humans do.
Right, but the answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community and you're not one of those 18-year-old kids that grows up with the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see, and that's all you know.
Examine the situation. When a black kid's coming up and he's being pulled over by the cops every minute, harassed by the cops. I mean, remember the stop and frisk in New York? I mean, they were pulling brothers over. You be walking down the street, cops roll up, jump out their car, throw you up against the fence, pull their guns out, put guns to your head, threaten you, okay, for nothing, just to search you, just to see if maybe you got a gun on you. It was under the auspices of broken windows, or that, stopping petty crimes would stop bigger crimes, which was a lie. It was basically urban terrorism. And so what happens to a young man is he begins to learn, I could go and try to go up into white society. But if I go up into white society, I'm going to experience the racism and the being held down that this cop shows me every day. Or I could switch and go with my homies who many a times are dying out here, but are taking extreme risks to circumvent this white racist system in an attempt to get rich and to live good for even a short period of time rather than struggle for a lifetime against a people who are constantly oppressing you, who are 10 times more powerful than you. What kind of choice is that? So it's not that he's making a bad choice. He's actually making a sensible choice for the environment that he's in. Of course, it's not fully sensible, like it's a good thing to be a drug dealer. But if you're halfway an intelligent kid and you start looking at both sides of the coin and you look at the averages, it starts to look like, a short-term life of doing evil is better than a long-term life of suffering under these people until they destroy you. And the problem is conservatives and white people in general just don't understand how brutal they are. White people have to learn that you are the Nazis, and you're the Nazi party. That's who you are to blacks in America. Whether we say it consciously or openly or what, that's who you are. And Rogan tries to make a good argument to say, you know, you're simplifying a horrible situation, again, that they created. And it burns me up to hear them act like you got to make better decisions. You got to, you know, at some point you can't blame society. Here's the better decision that's never discussed. Here's the better decision. The better decision is getting away from you. Is getting away from white America. That's the better decision. Like if you really wanted to make a decision on how you help black people, how you fix it, let's stop at some point blaming white America. The only way you could stop blaming white America is to get away from white America's racist institution. How do you do that? Separation. You start to move away from today's society and you start to build a pro-black society. Some would like to call it black supremacy. Call it what you will. If getting away from oppression of white society and trying to build black society is black supremacy, then so be it. Then every time you try to rescue dogs, and every time I turn on the ASPCA and see them saying that dogs are endangered because of the way people are treating them, then let's call the ASPCA a racist organization, because they are trying to separate dogs that are being injured and abused, okay, into a safe space or a safe home so that they no longer be abused. Well, guess what? Black people should do the same thing. They should start to try to move away from you so that they can be in a safe space somewhere in America where they don't have to be abused by you. But you look at that like that's black supremacy, like that's racist, like that's seeking black power instead of equality. Well, you ain't doing it for the dogs. Why are you doing it, trying to do it for us? Why are you selling us with that lie? And why should we believe that lie when we've had 350 years to know that you never was that way?
Right, but the answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community and you're not one of those 18-year-old kids that grows up with the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see, and that's all you know.
I want you to stay strong in the spirit of the Lord. Hey, listen, if you like this tape, hit the like button and share it, man. Hit the share button. Everybody share it to their own personal Facebook accounts. Share this video, man, to wake up brothers and sisters all over this earth. Hit the like button. Check me out Monday night. I'm live every Monday night. I bring the heavy hitters in. We do it up live right on this same channel. I'll see you then, Israel. Y'all